The message came in broken pulses. At first, everyone thought it was just noise, cosmic radiation bouncing through the void, maybe a dying star spitting its last breath. But something about the rhythm bothered Mark. He wasn't a scientist or some genius programmer. He was just a comms technician on the graveyard shift at one of the last analog outposts in orbit. Hell, most of his systems were held together with duct tape and stubbornness. But this wasn't static. There was structure. It was 3 a.m. station time, and Mark had been sipping cold coffee out of a cracked mug when he first caught the signal. Low frequency. Repeating. Like a heartbeat from a grave. He sat up straight, fingers hovering over the dusty control panel. "That's not natural," he muttered. He isolated the channel, then boosted the gain. The signal grew louder, more distinct, a series of pulses, then a pause, then again. He tapped a few keys, the old terminal wheezing like it was dying. "What the hell are you?" he whispered. No AI filtered it. No government-approved software meddled with its content. That's what made Outpost 9 special, its irrelevance. Nobody cared what they did up there, which is exactly why Mark didn't report the signal. Not right away. He spent the next few days deciphering it in silence. Every instinct in him said this wasn't some natural occurrence. This was language. Maybe not human. Maybe not even meant for us. But it was trying. And no one else had noticed. He didn't sleep, he didn't eat much either, just listened, studied. Until finally, after 72 hours of feeling like his brain was melting, he cracked a pattern. It wasn't a full translation, just a phrase he was sure of. "They will burn us all." His skin went cold. He replayed that part a dozen times. It wasn't metaphor, it wasn't poetry, it was a warning. He sent the decoded sample to Earth, flagged as low priority. He knew the bureaucrats would laugh. They always did. But that night, for the first time in his 5-year tour, a military black ship docked at Outpost 9. 3 men in gray uniforms stepped aboard without speaking. No insignia, no names, just cold eyes and 2 clean boots. They didn't ask permission. They didn't salute. They simply handed Mark a sealed envelope with a line typed across it. "Forget the message, you never heard it." They wiped his systems. Every drive, every backup. Even the analog recorders were melted down in acid. When Mark protested, just once, they broke his wrist, smiled as they did it, told him this was a global security issue, and then they left. But they didn't know Mark had made a handwritten copy of the pulses. He'd carved them, yes, carved them, into the steel underside of his sleeping cot with a broken screwdriver. Paranoia had kept him alive this long. He wasn't about to trust anyone with something that had begged for help through the vacuum of space. The next few months, he lived like a ghost. Walking shadows, watching the sky. The signal stopped coming. But something worse took its place. Black ships started appearing more often. No explanation. Civilian satellite networks began going offline, one by one. The news reported maintenance, but Mark knew better. Something was coming. And someone out there, someone not human, had tried to warn us. We just weren't supposed to hear it. But we did. And that meant only one thing. Whatever wanted them silenced was coming for us next. He didn't leave Outpost 9, not because he couldn't. They'd offered him a forced transfer after the black ship incident, somewhere down in Argentina, but because he wouldn't. Mark had been many things in his life. A dropout, a radio nerd, a drunk, a man who let his brother die in a fire because he couldn't pull him out fast enough. That one haunted him most. But a coward? Never. So he stayed. In the silence. With the carved codes under his cot and the crack in his wrist that never fully healed. And for 6 months, Earth slept, ignorant, blissful, but not quiet. Outpost 9 still caught things, little things, bursts of interference, anomalies in gravitational scans. Mark wasn't alone either. A few other techs across isolated stations began reaching out, quietly, through encrypted back doors and unofficial channels long thought dead. Some were like him, paranoid, stubborn, too broken to trust the system. Others were idealists, still believing in what humanity used to be before everything became about security clearances and data blackouts. They called themselves Echoers. A stupid name, Mark thought. But it stuck. They all had one thing in common. They'd heard something they shouldn't have. Mark became the reluctant center of their circle. He hadn't asked to lead. He barely knew how to take care of himself most days, but he was the first to listen. And the only one who'd been punished for it. The signals returned in fragments, hidden behind cosmic noise, buried under asteroid interference, disguised as background radiation. And the message, the real one, began to take shape. It wasn't just a warning. It was a plea. They found us. We hid as long as we could. Do not respond. They listen. Burning worlds. They burn everything that resists. And then, a final phrase, one that made Mark's blood run cold. Earth is next. He played it over and over. He didn't sleep for days. Every time he blinked, he saw it, the words lighting up his terminal like a death sentence. Earth is next. Earth is next. He couldn't sit still, couldn't wait. So he did what he swore he never would. He called her. Anya. She worked for the Defense Directorate, or at least she used to before her ethics got in the way. Mark hadn't spoken to her in 3 years. Not since she walked out and called him a coward for staying silent about a lunar mining accident that killed 7 men. She was right then. And maybe still now. She answered on the second ring. Her voice hadn't changed. Didn't think you'd ever crawl back, she said. I've got something real, he replied. You always do, Mark. Then it disappears, or you get drunk, or the government tells you to forget it. So why is this time different? Because it's not just a signal. It's a warning, and they're coming here. There was a long silence. Then she said, You're going to need to prove it. He didn't argue. He just sent the file, the waveform, the decoded message, and most importantly, the frequency overlap with Earth's own military satellites. 2 hours later, she sent a single message back. Get off that station, now. But it was already too late. The lights went out. Mark had been sitting at his console, hands trembling from too much caffeine and not enough sleep, when the hum of the station died. No warning. No flicker. Just silence. He stood, heart pounding, and grabbed the emergency flashlight from the drawer. The air was still breathable, for now, but the ventilation system was offline. That meant he had about 6 hours before CO2 became a problem. He tried the backup systems. Dead. The comms panel? Nothing. And then, just as he was about to try rerouting power manually, he heard it. A thud. Not from the control room, not from the hallway. It came from outside, from the hull. Mark froze. His breath hitched. That wasn't possible. There were no scheduled dockings, no rescue crews, no maintenance teams. No one was supposed to know where he was, except Anya, and she didn't have access to black ships. He killed the flashlight and backed away slowly, listening. Another thud, closer, a scraping sound, metal on metal, like claws dragging across the outer surface. Then, silence again. Until the external camera feed, thought to be fried, flickered back on for a split second. Just long enough for Mark to see something crawling across the outer shell of the station. It wasn't human. It wasn't even trying to be. It moved in jerks and stutters, limbs bending wrong, head lolling like it didn't belong to the body. He staggered back from the screen. Whatever it wasn't just here to look. It was here to make sure the message never reached anyone else. They had found him, and they were already inside. Mark didn't have a gun. He didn't believe in them, not after what happened with his brother, a memory he shoved deep whenever it tried to surface. But now, he'd kill for one. Instead, he grabbed a crowbar, heavy, rusted, real. He moved through the corridors slowly, flashlight off. The emergency lighting flickered, casting long shadows. Every step echoed like a scream in the silence. He passed the reactor room. It had been breached. Someone or something had clawed through the inner seal like it was paper. The station's power wasn't down from a glitch. It was sabotaged. He reached the armory. Locked. He hesitated, then used the crowbar to pry the panel off the access terminal. Took 15 minutes, bloodied his fingers, but he got it. Inside, he found what he was hoping for, a kinetic rail pistol, old but loaded. He took it, strapped it to his leg, and then the hallway behind him groaned. Mark spun. The corridor was empty, but something was moving, fast. He caught just a blur before it vanished down the next bend. His hand tightened around the pistol. "Come on then," he muttered. "Let's see what you're made of." He followed. Quiet as he could. But it didn't matter. The thing didn't care about stealth anymore. It wanted him to follow. And when he turned the next corner, he saw why. The thing wasn't alone. There were 3 of them now. No mouths, no eyes. Just pale, stretched skin and limbs that looked too long for their frames. They stood silently at the far end of the corridor, heads tilted at unnatural angles, watching, waiting. Mark raised the pistol. "Back the hell off!" They didn't move. He fired once, direct hit. The bullet tore through the first one's chest. No scream, no blood. It fell. But the other 2 didn't flinch. In fact, they smiled. It was a terrible smile, like they had just confirmed something. "You can kill one," Mark whispered to himself, stepping back. "But they don't care. They just want to see if you're willing to do it." He ran, down the corridor, toward the escape pod hatch. He didn't care if it was a trap. He couldn't stay in the station. Not anymore. As he neared the pod chamber, alarms blared. The systems were trying to reboot. Emergency override triggered. Anya. She was getting him out. He launched the pod without waiting. As it broke away from Outpost 9, he saw the breach in the station's hull from the outside. And through the cracked window of the control room, he saw dozens of those creatures watching him leave. Not chasing, just watching. Because he wasn't the target anymore. Earth was. And the only thing standing between it and whatever the hell these things were, was him. And a message that was never supposed to be heard. The escape pod screamed through the atmosphere like a falling coffin. Inside, Mark braced against the violent tremors. Fingers clenched around the rusted safety bar. The heat shields groaned. A thin crack ran along the viewport, distorting the blue arc of Earth below into something jagged and broken. Fitting, he thought. As the pod sliced through the upper layers, friction wrapped it in fire. He should have blacked out from the G-forces alone, but his body was running on too much adrenaline and not enough fear. Or maybe the fear had passed. It had changed shape into something colder, conviction. He didn't know if he was bringing Earth a warning or death itself. The pod hit the water just west of the Galapagos. Hard, violent, unforgiving. Saltwater rushed in through a fractured seal as the module sank. Mark punched the manual release and fought his way out with lungs screaming. The ocean welcomed him with chaos. Wind, rain, and waves that didn't give a damn he had just survived something impossible. He broke the surface, coughing and blind, then clung to a floating panel ripped from the pod's hull. A boat found him 2 hours later. An unmarked vessel, white hull, no flag. "Mark," a woman called as he was pulled aboard. Anya. She looked older. Her sharp edges had been dulled by years away from politics, from truth, from war. But her eyes were the same. Steel under pressure. "You look like hell," she said, wrapping a towel around his shoulders. He didn't smile. "You should see the things that chased me." She said nothing. But he caught the way her jaw tensed. She already knew. Anya had set up a safe house in Quito, in the mountains, high enough to be out of the surveillance nets and old enough to be ignored. The building creaked in the wind, and the generators moaned like dying beasts. But Mark felt safer there than he ever had under the polished glass towers of the old Defense Directorate. He slept for 18 hours. When he woke, she was waiting with coffee and a datapad full of decrypted messages. "You weren't the only one who heard the signal," she said, "but you were the only one dumb enough to go public with it." Mark took the coffee, hands still shaking. "They came after me. They were inside Outpost 9. Creatures, not human, not even trying to pass as one." She nodded. "I know. We've seen them before. Not many lived to report it." "Then why hasn't the world been warned?" She looked at him, dead on. "Because the world doesn't care until it's bleeding, and by the time it bleeds, it's already too late." He stared at the datapad. "So we just wait?" "No," she said. "We hunt them first." He blinked. "You have a team?" "Not anymore." Her voice was flat. "The Directorate buried the project, disavowed everything. But I kept some files, some contacts, enough to build a net." "A net for what?" "To catch one alive." Mark sat back, stunned. "Are you insane?" She leaned forward. "You said they're coming, right? Earth is next? Then we need leverage. We need to know what they want, what they fear, what they're made of." "You want to interrogate one of those things?" "I want to dissect its mind before it kills millions." There it was, the Anya he remembered. Not the bureaucrat, the soldier. The one who once exposed a classified operation that used experimental neuroweapons on untested colonies. The one who nearly got black-bagged for telling the truth. She didn't play games. And maybe, Mark thought, that was exactly what humanity needed now. They traveled light. No entourage, no backup. Just the two of them and a half-functioning AI drone Anya called Brick, because of its complete lack of personality. Their first stop was a military scrapyard outside La Paz, a rusted graveyard of downed satellites and failed prototypes. Hidden beneath the shells of outdated drones was a black crate marked Project Echo Black, one of the last unlicensed EMP net traps designed to capture non-human threats. A ghost weapon. Officially, it never existed. Mark pried open the crate, revealing a tangle of coils and modular nodes. He whistled low. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. "Stole it from a lab that burned down 2 days later," she replied. He didn't ask more. Next came bait. And bait meant contact. They tracked a pattern of electromagnetic anomalies, subtle, irregular, almost intentionally disguised, across southern Peru. The echoers, scattered and silent as ever, confirmed sightings, animals missing, shadows moving too fast, drones shutting down without cause. They narrowed it down to an old hydroelectric plant abandoned after a landslide years ago. "We trap it here," Anya said, pointing to the control room's sub-basement on an ancient blueprint. "Seal all exits, trip the net. And pray it doesn't kill us both." Mark stared at the map. His gut twisted. He had stared into those things' eyes, or lack of them, and seen what came next. Death. Silence, not rage or hunger, just clinical, calculated erasure. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said. "I don't," she replied, honest, "but doing nothing means letting them win." So they did it. For 2 days of setup, Mark rewired the net by hand. The power grid was busted, so they used old marine batteries to feed the trap. Anya rigged motion sensors and manual detonators. No remote triggers. Too risky. Too hackable. Then they waited. Night came fast in the Andes. The air turned sharp, cold, merciless. And just after midnight, the lights flickered. Brick went offline. Mark's breath caught. "It's here." They hunkered down in the control room, watching the feed from an old analog camera jury-rigged to a car battery. Nothing. Just black. Then movement. A blur. And then, contact! The net flared blue as arcs of electricity licked the shadows. A shriek tore through the facility, not sound, but pressure, like the air itself was screaming. Mark sprinted down the metal staircase, Anya at his heels. In the center of the trap, writhing and twitching, was the creature. Pale. Thin. Insectoid, but wrong. No armor, no tech, just flesh. It hissed at them, mouth opening too wide, as if the skin was just pretending to be a face. Mark aimed the rail pistol. "You sure we want it alive?" "No," Anya said, raising her own gun. "But we need it alive." The thing lunged against the field, twitching violently. The net held, barely. Mark took a step forward. "You sent the message, didn't you?" It stopped, its head tilted, just like the one on Outpost 9. Then it spoke, not in sound, not in voice, in thought. "Not us, not message. We run, we scream, you hear?" Mark staggered. The voice was inside his skull, not alien, human, twisted but familiar. "Wait, you're not the ones trying to kill us?" The thing shook, limbs twitching violently. Electricity crawled across its spine. "We are prey, not hunters. We flee. You answer. They come." Anya's face went pale. Mark understood. The creatures weren't the threat. They were the warning. The real enemy was still out there, and it had followed the signal back. The trap failed 10 minutes later, not because the creature broke it, but because something else shut it off. 1 second they had a captive. The next, the lights vanished, and the world turned cold. Mark turned in time to see the creature vanish, not run, not die, just blink out of existence. A sound followed, low, deep, not mechanical, hungry. They grabbed what they could and ran, out of the facility, into the mountains. No time for answers, no time for strategy. The storm had begun, and Mark knew, deep down, the message had never been about a war. It was about extinction. And humans, for once in their history, had answered a call that wasn't for them. And now, the real monsters were coming. 3 hours later, satellites started going dark. Not just surveillance eyes. Everything. Military arrays, orbital comms, GPS nodes, weather systems, dropped offline in unison like someone had pulled the plug on Earth's brain. No warning. No chatter. No countermeasures. Mark and Anya sat inside a worn-down truck, engine rumbling as they descended the dirt roads out of the Andes. Rain hammered the windshield. The radio spat, static. Brick, still glitching from the EMP, sparked once and finally died in the back seat. Mark watched the power lines along the valley. No lights, no hum. The world was going dark, and it wasn't a solar flare. It wasn't sabotage. It was a prelude. "They're disabling us," Anya said, checking a hand-drawn map she'd dug up from some forgotten directorate archive. "Systematically. They know where to hit. the comms, the satellites. Next is infrastructure, power grids, water systems, then transit, then air. Mark lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Then people. She didn't argue. It wasn't a war, not in the way humans had prepared for. There were no broadcasts, no threats, no demands, just a systematic shutdown, like a factory reset. They made it to a resistance safe house outside Cusco by dawn, if you could call it that. A half-collapsed warehouse hidden behind a hydroponic farm. Protected by a perimeter of scrap drones and old-school tripwires. Inside were 23 people, engineers, hackers, ex-soldiers. All part of the underground net of echoers who had refused to buy the silence the Directorate had tried to sell for years. Most had seen things. A few had survived them. All of them looked at Mark like he was death-walking. "You were the first," one of them said. A thin man with burn scars across his arms and a homemade rifle strapped to his back. Mark nodded. Slowly. "I heard the signal." "No," the man said. "You answered it." The weight of that was still crushing. He hadn't meant to. He'd just been curious, obsessed, lonely. But he hadn't realized that sometimes, when you look into the dark, something looks back and follows. The creature they'd caught, the knot hunters, they had fled from something older, something bigger. Anya and a biologist named Navarro pored over the psychic impressions Mark remembered from the creature's mental burst. No data, no files, just memory in the rawest form. It painted a picture no one wanted to believe. Not machines. Not aliens in the traditional sense. Not conquerors. Cleaners. They weren't sent to enslave. They weren't here to rule. They were removal systems. Biological software. Precision-crafted extinction agents. Not born, not grown, deployed. By who? That part remained unclear, but the creature, the one that had reached out, had shown Mark glimpses of dying worlds. Oceans turned to glass, cities melted into white ash, species blinking out of time, all after they had reached a specific technological threshold. Mark remembered the voice. "You hear, you see, they come." The signal hadn't just been a warning. It had been a beacon, and Earth, in its blind arrogance, had amplified it. By nightfall, the sky had changed. It wasn't just darker. It was wrong. Mark stood on the rooftop with a cracked scope, staring upward. The stars were shifting, subtly, like someone had pulled a curtain over the sky and drawn it just enough to break the pattern. "We're not looking at the same stars anymore," he whispered. Anya joined him, tightening her jacket. "Refraction?" "Lensing," Navarro said from below. "Localized gravitational distortion. It means there's mass up there." "How much?" Navarro didn't answer. Because he couldn't. That night they saw the first strike. A town in Brazil, small, mostly off-grid, just gone. No explosion, no flash, just silence. Drones sent to investigate returned footage of flat terrain where homes, roads, and people once stood. Not scorched, not vaporized, erased, as if nothing had ever existed there at all. And it was spreading. By midnight, 3 other zones had vanished. Parts of Angola, central Indonesia, northern Alaska. Same effect. A kind of void left behind, like the world had glitched and overwritten entire regions. Mark gripped the edge of a rusted railing. "How do you fight that?" No one answered. "Because you don't fight a delete button. You pull the plug before it finishes running the code." In the morning, Anya revealed a last-ditch plan. It wasn't military. It wasn't global. It was stupid. And it was all they had. We launch a jamming pulse from the Antarctic relay tower, she said, spreading out a map across a metal table. High-band, low-frequency resonance, reverse-engineered from the original signal. If we're right, it might block the trace. You think that'll stop them? Navarro asked. No, she replied, but it might make them lose interest, like corrupting a scent trail. If they can't track us anymore, maybe they move on. Mark frowned. And if they don't? Then at least we bought time. Everyone went quiet. Because time was the one thing no one had anymore. The relay tower was a relic, built in the 2040s for experimental deep space comms, abandoned by 2060 when the satellite net made it obsolete. The only thing keeping it alive now were the batteries installed by rogue operators looking for a blind spot. Getting there wouldn't be easy. The global grid was collapsing. No planes, no official routes. Surveillance systems were failing, but whatever these cleaners were, they didn't need cameras. They felt. Mark volunteered first. He always figured he'd die in space, alone, quiet, but dying on Earth, doing something that mattered, that sounded better, even if he didn't believe in second chances. The trip took 4 days through hell. Chartered cargo ships, rented skiffs, hacked transport drones. The echoers cleared paths, built temporary signal jammers, fed false GPS data to confuse whatever systems still functioned. They weren't fighting nations. They were running from gods. By the time they reached the outer shell of the Antarctic relay zone, they'd lost 4 people, not to violence, not to weapons, to disappearance. 1 second walking with the group. Next step? Gone. Not even a footprint left. As if they'd never lived. Mark stopped looking behind him after the second one. He couldn't stomach the way the universe refused to care. The relay tower still stood, barely, frost-coated, covered in centuries of ice and forgotten warnings. The entrance hatch was rusted shut. Anya blew it open with thermite. Inside was colder than death, but the core systems were intact. Analog, old, untouchable. Mark activated the console. It roared to life like an angry beast from another century. "This'll work," he said, surprised. "Only once," Anya reminded him. Navarro fed the signal fragment they'd pulled from the creature's mind into the modulation system. They layered it with white noise, harmonic disruptors, pulse echoes, a counterscent. The idea was simple. If Earth was now a beacon, they'd turn it into white noise. Nothing to trace, nothing to follow. Just silence. Mark stared at the transmit button. "Think it matters?" he asked. Anya looked tired. "Probably not," she said, "but it's ours to try." So Mark pressed the button, and the machine screamed. Not in sound, but in pressure. The air folded, the walls twisted, the floor shook. Navarro shouted something. Mark didn't hear. The lights pulsed red. And then, nothing. Silence. Just like that, it stopped. The air stilled. The earth stopped shaking. And when Mark looked outside, the sky was empty again. They stayed up all night watching for the stars to shift. They didn't. The signals stopped. The disappearing zones halted. It was like the universe had blinked and moved on, like a predator losing the scent. Mark sat alone near the tower's base, chain-smoking, unable to speak. Anya joined him eventually, sat beside him. No words, not heroes. Not saviors, just 2 tired people who answered a call that was never meant for them. And maybe, just maybe, helped Earth get ignored long enough to matter later. Mark chuckled, bitter. "We saved the world by making it smell like shit," he muttered. Anya grinned. "Fitting." He looked at the stars, finally calm. Think they'll come back? Her voice was quiet. Always. And the worst part was, they both knew she was right. But when they did come again, Earth would be ready. Not because of armies, not because of weapons, but because someone, somewhere, listened. And that was the one thing these things had never planned for. Humans. Impossible, illogical, irritating, unkillable. We weren't meant to hear it. But we did. And it changed everything. The tower didn't explode. That was the first miracle. Mark sat alone on the rooftop, boots resting on the ledge, a rusted antenna pressed to his shoulder like a rifle he didn't know how to fire. The cold didn't bother him anymore. Antarctica had become home. Quiet, numb, honest. They'd sent the counter signal 5 days ago, and nothing had happened. Which was the problem? Anya said it was a win. Navarro said it bought Earth breathing room, maybe even decades if they were lucky. But Mark didn't trust silence. He'd been listening to noise his whole life. Static, hums, frequency anomalies. He knew when something was hiding behind the quiet. And this? This was too still. A dead animal doesn't lie out in the open unless the predator wants you to see it. The others went back to work, rebuilding shattered infrastructure, reconnecting the scattered echoers, restoring damaged satellites one rig at a time. Everyone was talking about hope. Even Navarro had started writing reports for the directorate again. He called it reconstruction. Mark called it naive. Anya was already drafting plans to militarize the tower's counter-signal. She wanted a global net of resonance jammers, said it was the only way to make sure the scent trail stayed corrupt. Mark didn't argue. He didn't volunteer either. He knew in his bones the real threat hadn't left. It had just changed shape. On the 6th night, he dreamed of the creature, not the one they captured, not the one from Outpost 9. This one was taller, slimmer. It stood in the corner of his vision, unmoving, like a shadow with eyes. But it had no face. Still. He knew it was staring at him. He tried to move, couldn't, tried to scream. Silence. It raised a hand, 5 fingers. Each finger was a shard of broken mirror, and in them he saw images flash like fire. Earth, empty. Anya, screaming. The tower, sinking beneath black water. Himself, alone, kneeling before something massive and shapeless. Then the shadow stepped forward and whispered in a voice that was his own. You gave them the scent. You buried it deep. Now you carry it inside. He woke up vomiting blood. Navarro ran tests, brain scans, neural mapping. No pathogens, no foreign energy, he said, confused. You're clean. Mark wasn't convinced. I don't feel clean, he muttered, scrubbing blood from his lips. He stopped sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, it was there, the shadow with no face. He heard it when he was awake now, too. Not a voice, not like the creature from the net trap. This was different. This was like his own voice, but broken, like his thoughts weren't his anymore. At first he thought it was stress, trauma. But then he started noticing things. He could finish sentences before people said them. Feel moods change in the room like pressure drops. He knew when Navarro was going to lie, knew when Anya was going to snap at him before she even opened her mouth. And worse, he knew what they were dreaming about. The cleaners, or whatever higher system had created them, hadn't left. They had simply switched tactics. If brute force failed, they would erode from within. Mark was the first, but he wouldn't be the last. It started with headaches, then nosebleeds. By day 9, 3 other echoers at the tower began showing the same symptoms. One put a bullet through his own skull on day 10. No note. Just a bloodied wall and a journal with 4 words scrawled over and over again. "They are inside us." Mark finally broke. He locked himself in the sub-level bunker and demanded a full-body isolation scan. Navarro protested. Anya ordered him to open the door. He refused. "You know what this is," Mark said through the intercom. "You're just scared to admit it." Anya's voice was steel. "I know what this is. It's guilt. You think you caused this, so now you're hallucinating it." "I'm not hallucinating," he said. Then he closed the channel. Because behind her words, behind her calm, he had felt it. She was hearing the voice, too. The cleaner program was psychic, or rather, pre-conscious. Not language, not thought, just pressure inserted at the root level of perception. The signal they had intercepted hadn't been a broadcast. It had been a defensive scream, like a deer crying as it's torn apart, not to warn others, but because pain couldn't be held in. Mark had heard it, amplified it, and now he carried it. The jamming signal had worked, yes, but not by erasing the scent. It had simply masked it with something else. Mark. He had become the new beacon, and now they were coming again. But this time, not for Earth. For him. He told Anya everything. She didn't believe him. Not fully. But she listened. Maybe that's why he loved her, even now. She didn't need to agree to stand beside him. "We have to isolate you," she said. "No," Mark said. "We have to go deeper." She frowned. "Into the signal?" "Into me." Navarro built a neural feedback loop, a crude psychic dive interface, once used in experimental dream therapy. Illegal now. Too dangerous. They set it up in the lower chamber, the old cryo-vault that still had shielding from the original lunar comms tests. Mark lay on a steel cot, electrodes strapped to his temples, a slow IV drip feeding him stabilizers. Anya sat at the console, eyes grim. "You come back from this," she said. Mark gave her a crooked smile. "If I come back wrong, you put me down." She didn't argue, didn't even blink. Then she activated the loop, and Mark fell. It wasn't like dreaming. It wasn't like anything. He was inside his own mind, but not alone. The corridors of thought twisted. Familiar memories bled into impossible landscapes. The fire that killed his brother replayed, only this time. Mark wasn't reaching in. He was standing next to the shadow, watching, smiling. "You blame yourself," the voice whispered. "So we grew in that guilt. You fed us with pain, with doubt, with meaning." Mark stumbled through a corridor of twisted faces. All the echoers, all dead, all staring. "You're not real," he said. "Neither are you," the voice replied. Mark fell again, deeper this time, into a memory that wasn't his, a planet burning, cities screaming. A creature, the same type they had captured, running through fire, holding something in its claws. Not a weapon. A child. Mark felt it. The terror, the desperation, the signal, the scream. It wasn't meant to lure death. It was calling for mercy. And someone, something, had followed it back, not to save, but to finish the job. Mark grabbed the memory and held it, felt it burn through him, the weight of 1,000,000 deaths, the pressure of extinction. And he did the one thing the system couldn't predict. He didn't run, he didn't fight, he opened himself fully to it. "Come on," he whispered. "All of you. Take it. Take me. I'll show you what real pain feels like." And he gave them everything, his guilt, his grief, his fury, his humanity, not logic, not data, rage, a flood of it, hot, blind, relentless. It slammed into the shadow like a tidal wave, and for the first time, it screamed. Not him, it. Mark awoke screaming. covered in blood, eyes wild. Anya was holding him down. Navarro was yelling something about seizures, heart rate spikes. But Mark just kept screaming. Because he wasn't alone anymore. He was still carrying it. But now, it was afraid of him. They gave him 2 days. 2 days to recover from the seizure that nearly stopped his heart. 2 days of staring at concrete ceilings and flickering bulbs, trying to piece together the impossible images still burning inside his skull. Anya stayed with him. Never said much, just kept watch. Her hands always hovered near her pistol, and she didn't bother hiding it. She knew he wasn't entirely himself anymore. But she also knew Mark, and if there was one thing she could trust, it was that if anyone came back from the edge dragging hell behind him, it'd be this man. On the morning of the 3rd day, Mark stood up without help, walked to the mirror bolted to the wall, and stared at his own reflection. He looked older, thinner. Eyes sunken like he hadn't slept in weeks, which was mostly true. But that wasn't what caught his attention. It was the stillness. His body felt quiet. But inside, something new was moving. Navarro called it a psychic rebound, an imprint left behind by the failed invasion, a scar of consciousness. Most would have cracked under the pressure. But Mark? He had stared into the cleaner's mental void, and instead of surrendering, he'd shoved a burning piece of himself into the darkness. And now, it was echoing back. "You're different," Navarro said, scanning his vitals. "Your brainwaves don't even match your pre-mission baseline. You're reading off the charts, not damaged, just tuned." "Tuned to what?" Mark asked. Navarro hesitated. "To them. But also, not just them." Anya crossed her arms. "Is he a threat?" Navarro shook his head. "He's something else. I don't even have a name for it." Mark spoke without blinking. "I do." They turned. He stared at them with hollow eyes, calm, focused. "I'm bait." They ran simulations. Navarro set up controlled neural chambers, tested psychic conductivity in isolated environments. Nothing matched what Mark could do now. He didn't broadcast thoughts. He didn't read minds. But he attracted them. The same way metal calls lightning. Cleaner signals, the ones thought suppressed by the counter-resonance, began resurfacing when Mark got too close to equipment. Instruments flared with background radiation. Old satellites started reacting to his presence, even when he wasn't transmitting. Whatever was still lurking in the black around Earth still sensed him. But now, it feared him too. "I saw it," Mark said one night, staring at a frozen field outside the relay station. "I touched it, and it couldn't hold me. It couldn't process what I was." Anya lit a cigarette beside him. "What are you, then?" He didn't smile. The thing it didn't predict. They built a trap, not to catch, not this time, to lure. Using Mark as the anchor, Navarro and a team of echoers wired the entire Antarctic relay into a signal chamber, one that could simulate the original cleaner frequency, but in reverse. Instead of calling out with fear, they would now shout with defiance, a noise too ugly, too chaotic, too human for the system to interpret. Anya called it the rebellion pulse. Mark just called it the truth. "You want a war?" he muttered into the mic before the first live test. "Come get it." And then they turned it on. Within 6 hours, everything changed. The stars above Antarctica shifted again. Slight, subtle, but undeniable, like curtains drawing open. Whatever had been waiting in the dark had finally seen something it couldn't ignore. Earth had answered back. But not with submission, not with cries, with a scream. The first reappearance happened in the skies above Kazakhstan, a black void, jagged at the edges like torn fabric, opened above the stratosphere and held there, pulsating. No ships, no lights, just presence. Watching. Waiting. Mark stood in the field outside the station, eyes fixed on the feed. "It's not just one," he said. Navarro looked up from his terminal. "You think they're all coming?" "No," Mark said. "They're already here. That's just the first one willing to be seen." Anya loaded a new magazine into her rifle. "Then let's give them a reason to leave." They launched the second pulse, longer, louder, sharper. This time they spiked it with what Mark had felt inside himself, raw emotion. Not just rage, not just pain, but loss, memory, fury, chaos. Love twisted into wrath, grief sharpened into knives, the kind of noise only humans could make. The kind that machines couldn't understand. The kind that even hyper-evolved cleaner systems couldn't code against. And it hit the sky like thunder from a dying god. The void flinched. Not physically, but Mark felt it, deep inside. A twitch, a retreat. "We're hurting them," he whispered. Anya leaned closer. "How much?" "Not enough." The third pulse came with a price. Navarro was monitoring the feedback loop when he collapsed. Blood from both ears, eyes open, mouth slack. Mark caught him just before he hit the floor. He wasn't dead, but his mind was gone. Locked in something invisible, some echo chamber where human thought couldn't follow. Anya shut down the transmitter immediately, but the damage was done. "We pushed too far," she said later, wiping blood off Navarro's face. Mark shook his head. "No, we got close." "You call this close?" "Yes," Mark said coldly, "because it means they can bleed." It became a cycle. Transmit, watch, analyze, lose someone, rebuild. Every time they sent the pulse, the sky changed. More voids, different places, some over oceans, some over major cities. One hovered above New York for 2 full minutes before vanishing. The world panicked. Governments collapsed. The directorate lost control. But the echoers, the ones who'd been waiting for this, they rose. A new net formed, not built by institutions but by individuals who refused to be erased. Mark became the anchor, the voice, the weapon. Not because he wanted it, but because no one else could carry the weight. And the cleaners, they began to crack. It started small. Flickers in their control zones, one of the erased sectors in central Indonesia, the one wiped from existence weeks ago, came back. Not fully, just a few structures, half a field. But that was enough. Anya stood over the report, eyes wide. "They're not deleting us, they're overwriting." Mark nodded. "And we're corrupting the code." The system wasn't flawless. It never expected resistance, never expected noise, and humans were nothing but noise. The final test came on the 30th day after the first pulse. Mark stood in the center of the resonance chamber. No electrodes, no safety net, no fallback. This was all him now. They loaded the full spectrum, every emotion, every frequency tied to the worst moments in his life. His brother's screams, the smell of burning flesh. The feel of cold steel when he tried to take his own life, once, years ago. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the hopelessness. They weren't scars anymore. They were ammunition. "Ready?" Anya asked. Mark didn't answer. He just smiled, then gave the nod. The switch flipped, and the world screamed. The voids shattered, not faded, not blinked, shattered, like broken glass in the sky. Chunks of blackness fell like snow, disintegrating before they hit the ground. People around the world looked up and saw stars again. Not the same ones, new ones, clearer, brighter, as if a veil had lifted. Whatever network the cleaners used to scan, hunt, and overwrite, it had fractured. Not because of weapons, not because of strategy, but because Earth had given them something they never planned for: the unfiltered horror of being human. Mark collapsed after the blast. He didn't wake up for 3 days. When he did, Navarro was sitting by the window. Reading, his eyes were focused, whole. "They let me go," he said softly. Mark nodded. "I figured." Anya came in later, sat on the bed without saying a word. After a while, Mark asked, "Did we win?" "No," she said, "but we scared them." That was enough. For now. The cleaners would return one day, systems always rebooted, but Earth would be ready next time, not with more bombs, not with stronger firewalls, but with memory, trauma, voices, pain, with people like Mark. With people who understood that the one thing the universe couldn't copy was soul. Mark didn't want the medals, didn't want the ceremony, didn't want the cameras, and he sure as hell didn't want the speech. But the world had changed, and so had he. The rebellion pulse had fractured the cleaner system. Not permanently, not entirely, but enough. Enough for humanity to matter, enough to survive. And when survival becomes history, the ones who did the bleeding always get dragged into the spotlight. They called him a hero, a psychic pioneer, a weaponized soul. None of it meant anything. The war wasn't over. It had just shifted, moved into quieter corridors, boardrooms, laboratories, governments. Earth had been seconds away from deletion. And now? Now it was bargaining with the aftermath. He walked through the burned-out shell of the Antarctic relay station one last time. They were decommissioning it. Too dangerous, they said. Too unpredictable. Of course it was. That was the point. But now the world wanted clean energy, clean skies, clean narratives. Mark was none of those things. Anya stood at the main gate, arms crossed, jacket fluttering in the wind. She hadn't changed much. Maybe a little colder, a little more tired. Her edges weren't rough. They were sharpened. "You sure about this?" she asked. Mark nodded. "I'm not the signal anymore. I'm just a man again." "That's not how the world sees it." He looked around at the half-melted steel beams, the cracked transmitters, the dead ground. "They don't get to decide who I am." She stared at him for a long time, then reached into her coat and handed him a small device. "What is it?" he asked. "A button. Does it work?" "It will." He didn't ask what it did. He didn't need to. It was a kill switch, for himself, or for whatever was still inside him. A backup plan, the only kind they trusted. She looked him in the eye. "If it ever comes back, if you feel it waking up again, I'll press it." And he meant it. Earth's recovery was as chaotic as its near death. In the absence of global communication, nations had reverted to self-interest. Alliances fractured. New leaders rose, some out of survival, others out of fear. China sealed its borders and created an internal resonance control network. The U.S. collapsed into a dozen regional coalitions, most run by private defense syndicates. Europe split, half spiritual revival, half tech cult. Africa and South America, burned hardest by the cleaner voids, became isolationist fortresses with no broadcast laws. The term psychic contamination became common language. Mark watched it unfold from a distance. He drifted between ghost towns, refugee shelters, old echoer safe zones now turned into underground societies. Some worshipped him. Others feared him. A few tried to kill him, but none of them understood him, because no one wanted to admit what had really happened. Earth hadn't defeated anything. It had just survived long enough to be reconsidered. Mark kept moving. No identity, no papers, just his face, still known in enough places to open doors or close them. He grew a beard, let his hair fall out naturally. He didn't hide, just stopped trying to be seen. Every night he checked the stars. Every night. They were different. Cleaner this time. Brighter. But never still. He knew they were watching. Just like before. Not with hatred, not with fear. With curiosity. The kind a system shows before deciding if a variable is still worth deleting. 6 months later, Navarro found him. He was living in the ruins of an old radar station in Argentina, off-grid, off everything. Navarro walked in like he still belonged, dropped his bag on the floor, and sat down without a word. He looked better. Whole. "I heard you were dead," Mark said. "I was," Navarro replied, "for about 6 minutes." They sat in silence for a while. Wind creaked the ceiling panels. Somewhere in the distance, something metallic howled in the wind. Navarro finally spoke. "They've begun again." Mark didn't have to ask who. "Where?" "Not Earth. Mars." Mark blinked. "We never re-established contact with Mars." Navarro nodded. "They did. A team of contractors, private initiative. They launched 2 probes. One made it. What did it find?" Navarro pulled out a data chip. Mark inserted it into the rusted console and watched. The screen showed static. Then terrain. Red plains. Abandoned structures from failed colonization efforts. Then something new. Not human, not cleaner, different. "Whatever the cleaners were avoiding," Navarro said, "it's there." Mark stared at the footage. The air felt colder. "Why would they avoid it?" "Because they weren't the apex predators in this galaxy," Navarro said quietly. "Just the janitors." The idea that something worse than the cleaners existed should have broken Mark. Instead, it clarified everything. The universe wasn't organized. It wasn't managed. It was a food chain. And humanity had just screamed loud enough to move one rung up. Not safe, just noticed. "What do they want?" Mark asked. Navarro shrugged. "The ones on Mars? No idea. The ones behind the cleaners? We may never know. But they know us now?" Navarro nodded. "Yes, and you're still the loudest voice in the room." They took a transport to Greenland, the only place still running low-band, analog tech untouched by psychic architecture. There, deep in the ice, Navarro showed Mark something else. A piece of the void. Not a creature, not a machine, just a fragment. Frozen. Still humming with faint, incomprehensible signals. "We think it's part of their neural relay system," Navarro said. "But every time we try to decode it, it changes." Mark approached the black shard, fingertips hovering over its surface. It felt familiar, like a memory half remembered. He pressed his hand against it. And for one split second, he heard everything. The cries of 1 billion dead, the thoughts of species gone long before Earth was born, the echo of a system breaking. Then it stopped. Mark staggered back, nose bleeding. "Did you see anything?" Navarro asked. Mark didn't answer right away. Then he whispered, "They weren't trying to delete us." "What do you mean?" "They were trying to prepare us." Navarro's eyes narrowed. "Prepare us for what?" Mark looked up at the stars and said nothing, because he wasn't sure. But he knew the next scream would come from further out. And this time? Earth might not be the only target. The stars above Greenland didn't shine like they used to. Not since the relay shattered the sky, not since the first pulse bent the voids backward. Mark had grown used to it, the way light flickered where it shouldn't, the way space seemed to breathe if you stared too long. He stood alone outside the ice dome, boots crunching through the snow, his breath fogging the night air like smoke from an old war he hadn't left behind. The shard Navarro had shown him was buried beneath 50 meters of reinforced cryoglass now. They called it Echo 1. Scientists from all over the fractured world had begun building a quiet obsession around it, none more so than Navarro. But Mark knew. You don't study an echo, you answer it, or you drown in it. Behind him, the station's door creaked open. Anya stepped out, wrapped in a heavy coat, the same one she wore when the cleaners first came. "You heard it again," she said, no question in her voice. Mark nodded. "Same frequency?" "No, lower, deeper. It's not a warning this time." She exhaled slowly, watching the frost leave her lips. "What is it then?" He looked at her, eyes empty. "It's an invitation." Inside the station, Navarro argued for caution. He always did. "We need more time to decode. We don't even know the signal's origin. We just know it's somewhere past Neptune." Mark didn't need coordinates. He felt it, like a second heartbeat under his skin. "It's not coming to us," he said. "It's waiting." Navarro frowned. "Then why reach out?" "Because it's curious. Because the scream we sent woke something up. And it's watching to see if we scream again, or if we come to find out why they stopped screaming first." The room fell silent. Anya rubbed her temples. "What happens if we go?" Mark didn't answer, because that wasn't the question. The question was, what happens if he goes and doesn't come back? In the decades before the cleaners, Earth had built ships meant for colonization. Most of them failed. But one prototype, an experimental long-range vessel built beneath the Pacific trenches, had been preserved. Hidden, sealed off after the Directorate collapse. Navarro found it, still functional, still waiting. "No crew," he said. "Only room for one. Enough supplies for a year, max. One shot." Anya stared at the blueprint. She didn't say no, but she didn't say yes either. "You go out there," she said to Mark later. "You might not find anything." He looked her dead in the eyes. "I might find everything." The launch wasn't public. There were no speeches, no send-offs, just a whisper through fractured networks that the man who screamed back at the void was leaving Earth. Again. Some called it suicide. Some called it destiny. Most were just relieved, because Mark had become a symbol no one could carry anymore. A reminder that the universe had noticed Earth, and still might come back to finish what it started. No one wanted to be the next target. Let him go. Let the scent leave with him. Let silence return. The ship, Echo Null, launched through a vertical pressure column inside the Marianas Trench. Mark sat alone in the cockpit, strapped in, heart slow. The stars above were covered by ocean for the first few hours. When the final lock released and the ship broke free of Earth's gravity, Mark didn't look back. He'd already said his goodbyes. Quiet ones. He'd whispered something to Anya. She didn't say it back. But that was okay. You don't carry love into the abyss. You leave it behind. So there's something worth coming back to. Deep space wasn't quiet. People believed it was, but that was only because their machines filtered out the madness. Mark turned the filters off, and he listened. Static, howls, bursts of energy that sounded like voices stuck between dying and becoming gods. The noise wasn't random. It was alive. And somewhere in it was the signal, the one waiting for him. He chased it for 30 days across the outer edge of the solar system, past the drift fields of broken satellites, past the bones of old missions, past Mars, where Navarro's transmission had first seen something else watching from the dust. And then, on day 31, he found it. Not a ship, not a station, a construct, floating in the dark, shaped like a ring broken in 3 parts, orbiting an invisible point. Massive, black, silent, no lights, no life, just presence. The signal was coming from its center. Mark slowed the ship, and the moment he entered its orbit, the construct woke up. He didn't dock. He didn't need to, because the moment the ship's systems registered the construct's rotation, his mind left his body. There was no pain, no transition. He was simply somewhere else. A void of blue light and distant echoes. Shapes danced around him, not humanoid, not alien, just patterns. Data, but alive. They watched him, not with malice. With recognition. "You survived," a voice said. Mark turned, though there was no direction. "Who are you?" The voice was not singular. "We are what came before. We are what cleaned, we are what broke." "You created the cleaners?" "We released them." "Why?" "Because we feared what we were becoming." Mark didn't understand. "The cleaners erased entire civilizations." "Yes, including our own." And that was when he realized the cleaners weren't weapons. They were mercy. A mercy program. Triggered when civilizations crossed the line from survival to self-destruction. Humanity had been flagged for deletion. But something changed. "You heard us scream," Mark said. "We heard you fight. Not each other. Not us. Yourselves." And suddenly he understood. It wasn't the scream that saved Earth. It was that he survived it. The scream had broken the system. Proven that something inside humans could carry the unbearable and still choose to go on. "What now?" Mark asked. The construct pulsed. "Now, you choose." A door opened in the void. Enter and learn, or leave and forget. Forget what? Everything. His memories, the war, the signal, the cleaners, Anya, all of it. He would return to Earth as a man who never answered the stars. A man without burden, without truth, without scars, or he could step through the door and never come back, never be human again. Mark stood at the threshold. He thought about Earth, about the ones who called him a hero, the ones who called him a threat. About Anya, and then he smiled and walked forward. They never found the ship. Echo Null's systems went dark 40 days after launch. No wreckage, no trace, just silence, the kind that comes after a question is finally answered. Anya never remarried, never stopped checking the night sky. Some say she saw something once, a flicker in the stars, a shape watching from the cold. But she never said what it was. Earth kept rebuilding. Quiet. But not blind. Because somewhere out there, Mark had found something. Something older than fear, older than systems, something that chose not to erase us, but to watch. And maybe one day, to come back and see what we'd become. Not because we screamed, but because we listened.